All sports dynasties must come to an end. However, the cause varies. For some, time simply catches up to the roster. For others, it's a case of bad roster management. In the case of the 1970s Miami Dolphins, however, their team, their dynasty, was derailed by a startup football league. Despite being perhaps the worst AFL team in the build-up to the league's merger with the NFL in 1970, things turned around quickly that season when the franchise hired Don Shula to be head coach and general manager. After having never won more than 5 games in a season, Miami notched 10 victories and its first playoff berth in 1970. Things were even better the following season when Shula led the Dolphins to the Super Bowl. Now, they did lose to the Dallas Cowboys, but things were unbelievably bright for Miami, and they were led by a complement of offensive stars all entering their prime. Hall of Fame quarterback Bob Greasy was never the most prolific passer. Miami didn't need him to be. They boasted the NFL's most dynamic rushing attack. We're talking about Larry Zonka, Jim Kick, and Mercury Moore simply just grinding teams into submission. When the Dolphins did need to pass, they simply looked to Paul Warfield, who was at the time the NFL's premier vertical threat. This, combined with an elite defense, set Miami up for what looked to be an unstoppable run during the 1970s. Everything came together in 1972 with the Miami Dolphins securing not only the Super Bowl but the perfect season, 17-0, and bringing the Super Bowl trophy back to South Beach. 1973 wasn't perfection, but it was still a really good year and another Super Bowl victory for the Dolphins. The back-to-back NFL champions looked to be unstoppable heading into the offseason after the 1973 season. Of course, this is a story, and it is going to take a turn for the worst right about here. When the Miami Heat built a super team, ultimately keeping it together wasn't in the hands of Pat Riley, but rather LeBron James. Free agency had given players all of the power in the NBA. The 1970s NFL was the complete opposite though. Free agency didn't exist then. Well, that's not entirely true, but the rules governing free agency were such bullshit that it was ruled to have violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. Owners, simply put, held all of the power. This left Miami in a position to dominate the 1970s. Now, while Warfield was in his early 30s and was obviously on the downside of his career, most of the core was under 30, and that meant it was a great time to be a Miami Dolphins fan. The Miami Dolphins had all of the makings of a super team who would three-peat in 1974. That is, until March 31st of that year. But before we understand the significance of that date, we need to revisit another date a few months earlier. On October 2nd, 1973, plans for a startup football league were announced. Nobody knew it at the time, but this would be the undoing of the Miami Dolphins dynasty. Now, of course, that did seem totally far-fetched when first announced. The public really had no idea what to expect when a group of investors got together and formed the World Football League, or WFL. It should be noted the idea of two rival football leagues competing was hardly a novelty in America at the time. After all, it happened throughout the entire 1960s. However, by 1973, the NFL had a much larger footprint that spanned from coast to coast in the US. The league also had far better access to talent in 73 than it did during the AFL days. In fact, the only real way for the WFL to sign any NFL players were to sign them to futures contracts or contracts that didn't kick in until the season after next. This brings us back to March 31st, 1974. The Toronto Northmen were one of the WFL's confirmed franchises at that time. Owner Johnny Bassett was an avid football fan. He would even actually go on to own a USFL team as well. Anyway, he really wanted to make a splash with his franchise and felt there was no better place to start than the two-time defending champion Miami Dolphins. He invited Csonka, Kick, and Warfield to Toronto, hoping to sign the trio to contracts to play for his team, the Toronto Northmen. Now that would come at a cost, and boy oh boy was that cost exorbitant. The trio, all represented by agent Ed Keating, asked for a combined guaranteed salary of $3.86 million over 3 years. Additionally, they asked for, I want to get this right. They asked for signing bonuses, guaranteed product endorsements, luxury apartments, automobiles, and travel expenses, among other things. This was completely and totally unheard of for an athlete at this time. Hell, Csonka, in the 1973 championship season with the Dolphins, made a paltry $55,000. It didn't stop there though. Bassett's offer was in the form of a guaranteed personal services contract. That meant the players would be played regardless of what happened to the WFL. Despite being offered more money, more guaranteed money than the trio would have ever imagined, they still really weren't convinced about playing in the WFL. Sometime during the visit, Csonka called up Dolphins head coach and general manager Don Shula, really just sort of asking him to have Dolphins owner Joe Robbie give him a call back. That's because the trio really found themselves at a bit of a bind at this point. None of them had expected to get everything they asked for and then some. On the other hand, they really weren't sure about playing in this startup league. However, Bassett had made it perfectly clear to them that if this contract was going to happen, they needed to sign it then and there while they were on their visit to Toronto. If the players left, the deal was off the table and not coming back. Csonka was really hoping Robbie would simply offer the trio improved deals that would allow them to keep playing in the NFL and for the Dolphins. Unfortunately, the owner never returned his call. Staring at guaranteed money and a bunch of other perks that were too good to turn down for their families, the trio put pen to paper and signed with the fledgling WFL. The very next day after those contracts were signed, the players appeared on ABC's Howard Cosell show, really just sort of announcing their intentions to leave the NFL and put the WFL on the map in the process. There was a catch, however. Earlier I mentioned futures contracts, and that's what these contracts were. Csonka, Kick, and Warfield would not be joining their new league and their new team until 1975, which meant 74 would be spent playing for the competitor, the NFL, and chasing the three-peat. all things considered, no other franchise in the NFL was on Miami's level heading into that 1974 season. Some pundits did believe the Oakland Raiders, led by John Madden, were closing the gap, and in fact they finished with the best record in football at 12-2. Over in Miami, Don Shula guided Miami to an 11-3 record, which was the second best in football. Unfortunately, and for reasons I'll never comprehend, the NFL didn't have seeding for the playoffs. Instead, playoff matchups were determined by a rotating basis, and as you can probably tell, the results were less than optimal. The winners of the AFC East and AFC West were slated to play each other in the divisional round of the NFL playoffs years in advance, no matter what happened during the 1974 season. That meant despite being the two best teams in football by record, the Raiders and Dolphins were paired together in the opening round of the NFL playoffs. The contest was billed as Super Bowl 8.5 because Super Bowl 8 was in 73, Super Bowl 9 was in 74. These were the two best teams, and the winner was pretty much expected to go on to win the championship that year. Of course, it didn't happen that way, but that's an entirely different story for an entirely different time. As for the game dubbed Super Bowl 8.5, it was an all-time classic. It lived up to all the hype and then some. Ultimately, the Raiders would win the game on a miraculous play that has since been dubbed the Sea of Hands. This was really a cruel way for the Dolphins' bid at a three-peat to end. As tough of a way as it was for Miami to lose that game and see their bid at a three-peat derailed, things got really worse really quickly when people started to realize, oh shit, Zonka, Kick, and Warfield are about to leave town and play in the WFL. Like, this was it. The dynasty was over, or at least you could make an argument that it seemed like stuff was going to change. The Dolphins season may have not ended how the team wanted it, but things were a million times worse over at the WFL. In reality, the first season in 1974 was nothing short of an epic disaster. Teams were moving in season, two teams folded in season, the playoff format wasn't decided until well into the regular season. The championship game was almost canceled by the IRS after one team failed to pay its taxes. Another owner had been funding his team by selling cocaine. So yeah, it wasn't exactly the endeavor the players had signed up for. But it got even worse. Like, believe it or not, it got even worse. For starters, when Zonka, Kick, and Warfield went to report to their new team, it wasn't in Toronto, but Memphis. Unfortunately, the Canadian government was highly protective of its beloved CFL and refused to let the Toronto franchise play games in Canada. So the team picked up sticks and headed to Memphis. Of course, the Northman name wouldn't really work down south, so Bassett just decided, hey, screw it, we're just calling the Southmen. We're still not at the bottom though. After what had transpired in its first season, the WFL went into 75 with no television contract, which meant no visibility for the league whatsoever. The season did start and some games were played, but attendance was terrible. The Chicago franchise would fold after about week 5 and things were looking pretty dire. By week 13, the WFL was done and dusted for good. The players would later admit that while they were excited about the prospect of playing in Toronto, the move to Memphis was a bummer and their hearts were never really into it. With the WFL gone, Bassett's last hope, or roll of the dice in this case, was to try and get his Southmen into the NFL. He actually had a pretty strong case, but the league was having none of it and simply just told him, get lost. When that happened, Bassett released Zonka, Kick, and Warfield from their contracts and they were free to sign with any NFL team. However, a deadline for player movement for the 75 season meant it was really impossible for them to get onto a team for that year, but starting in 76, they would be free to play wherever they chose in the NFL. The 1975 Miami Dolphins were still a pretty good football team even without their 3 stars. They just weren't good enough to make the playoffs despite finishing 10-4. Interestingly, all 4 of their losses would come against AFC sides who finished with 10 or more wins. With Miami sitting out of the playoffs for the first time in years, owner Joe Robbie apparently had a chance to undo his big mistake and bring the trio back for the 1976 season. Zonka was actually desperate for a return and would have done anything to go back. However, as Dolphin owners are wont to do, Robbie acted like a complete child, having the rushers' contract demands published in a local paper and calling them absurd. Unable to return to Miami, Zonka would sign with the New York Giants while Kick caught on with the Denver Broncos and Warfield would agree to terms with the Cleveland Browns. The latter actually had a really solid season in 1976, but the running backs didn't return to previous form. Things were going equally as bad over in Miami as the Dolphins would finish with a losing record under Shula for the first time ever. The offense in particular was quite disappointing this year, and the situation really didn't get better the following season in 1977 as the Dolphins found themselves out of the playoffs once again. Miami did make it back to the postseason in 1978, but this was a far cry from the team that was dominating the NFL at the start of the decade. Perhaps trying to undo what had happened years earlier, Shula reached out to Zonka about a possible reunion ahead of the 1979 season. Both Kick and Warfield had retired at this point. Meanwhile, Zonka really never did much during his time with the Giants. However, the Dolphins were looking at some depth at running back behind star Delvin Williams, and Zonka at least knew the playbook and could come in immediately and give them something. There was one thing though still standing in the way of a possible reunion, and that was Dolphins owner Joe Robbie, who hated Zonka's agent Ed Keating. In order to facilitate this deal, Shula totally went behind Robbie's back and basically went rogue to do everything and to get Zonka onto the Dolphins for the 79 season. The 33-year-old Zonka had his best season in the NFL since his first spell with the Dolphins. He rushed for 837 yards and scored an impressive 12 touchdowns. Zonka would even be named Comeback Player of the Year. Miami did qualify for the playoffs in 1979, but were resoundingly beaten by the eventual champion Pittsburgh Steelers. Ultimately, Zonka's feel-good return was too little too late in terms of breaking the curse, and he retired after the 79 season. It has been nearly 50 years since the Miami Dolphins have won a Super Bowl. Their last trip to the AFC Championship game was 1992. They haven't made it to the Super Bowl since 1984. But by no means have they been the worst team in the NFL. Far from it, in fact. If possible, Miami's fate has been even worse. It is a franchise that has simply hovered around average with the occasional spike mixed in here or there. They have finished with between 6 and 10 wins in 28 of the franchise's last 35 seasons. It's not quite bad enough to get a good draft pick, and not quite good enough to compete for a championship. It's purgatory. It would be easy to dismiss talk of a curse as hearsay. We don't really know how things would have turned out in Miami had Zonka, Kicken, Warfield all stayed the course and came back for 75. That's true, we don't know how it works, and there's a possibility, a high likelihood even, you could say, that maybe the Dolphins don't win another championship with those three. But you can't help but look back at Zonka's last season with the Dolphins and think about what if. In reality, there's no way Miami misses the playoffs all 3 seasons between 75 and 77. You have to think the trio gets them in the playoffs in 75 and maybe again in 76 and 77. I mean, really, this is a franchise that was a fluke touchdown pass away from what in all likelihood would have been their 3rd consecutive Super Bowl trophy. From an organizational standpoint, the decision by Robbie to not call the players back while they were in Toronto is simply the first in a long line of dubious decisions made by Dolphins owners over the past 5 decades. Wayne Huizenga and later Stephen Ross have been nothing short of terrible stewards for this franchise. The WFL, a startup league for all intents and purposes, failed miserably. Not only managed to end what was one of the NFL's greatest teams, but it remains a curse over the Miami Dolphins franchise to this day. The thing is, I don't know when the curse will be broken or how it will be broken, because if Dan Marino couldn't do it, I mean, what hope is there for anyone else?